Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give it just a few more seconds and let all the attendees come on, and then we'll get started. Okay, great. Well, it looks like we're at 1:01 p.m., so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our Road to the Budget Bill, part 3 of our webinar, which is the breakdown and analysis of the final provisions of House Bill 33, the budget bill. For those of you who were able to join us either for part 1 or part 2, then you know the cast of characters that you're seeing on the screen. But for those first timers, my name is Susan Keating Anderson. I am the practice group manager of the Education Law Group at Roetzel and Anderson, and I'm also a shareholder here at the firm. Joining me for this discussion today is my partner, Lisa Burleson. Lisa is a shareholder at Roetzel and Anderson, and she is an integral part of our Education Law Group, and she practices out of our Columbus office. And then also joining us is Sherri Warner. Sherri is a counsel attorney with Roetzel and Anderson out of our Columbus office as well. And she is also a director of Roetzel Consulting Solutions, our legislative arm of the firm. So this part 3 is set up a little bit differently than parts 1 and parts 2 were set up because we are covering more ground now that we have the final provisions of the bill. So what we've done is we've scheduled the first hour from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock to address the funding specific provisions of House Bill 33. And that conversation will be led primarily by Sherri Warner. So that will occur between 1 and 2 o'clock. At 2 o'clock, we will reserve 15 minutes for questions. And if anyone has any questions, go ahead and drop them into the Q&A box that you should be seeing at the bottom of your screen. And then at 2:15, once questions are done, we will take a 15-minute break. And we'll resume at 2:30 for an hour discussion of the non-funding provisions of the bill. So these are the substantive provisions that address, things other than funding for school district programming. And that conversation will be led primarily by myself and by Lisa Burleson. Again, we'll reserve 15 minutes after that time for questions, and then we'll conclude the program. So while we hope you all join us for the entirety of the program, certainly if there are, if you want to hear about the funding, but not necessarily the other components of it, you're welcome to jump on and off as you feel appropriate. So with all that said, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Sherri Warner, who is going to talk to you about the funding provisions in House Bill 33. Thanks, Sherri.
Thanks. So good afternoon, everybody. We are going to get started. The first thing to know is that the effective dates of House Bill 33 are split because it is an appropriation bill. Many of the provisions are effective on the date that it was signed, which is officially July 4th, 2023. Other provisions are effective 90 days after, which was October 3rd. And then there are some other provisions that may take effect within the bill at other times, and those provisions are specifically spelled out in the bill. So as all of you are aware, the primary way we fund schools in the state of Ohio is through the state funding formula. In the last General Assembly, we were able to get into law the Cutt-Patterson funding formula, which has all of these components which build the base cost of funding or educating a child. And then it goes through and it breaks down how that cost is going to be allocated between the state and between the local district, comes out with a number, and then that number is what is sent to the district to educate the child from the state funds. The plan, when it was implemented, there were concerns about the ability to continue to fund this plan going forward because they were concerned that the cost inputs were going to be very expensive. It was going to make this plan too difficult and too much of a drain on the state budget. So they put language in the last General Assembly, which said that the future of this formula would be pending future General Assemblies, and they could make decisions to change it. We were fortunate in this General Assembly, they did decide to continue to implement the fair funding formula, which was phased in over several years. One of the things that we did get in this funding formula is a cost input update from FY18 costs to FY22 costs. And then some other changes, tweaking done around the edges. As I said, this funding formula was phased in over several years. They have in this particular version accelerated the full funding of our DPIA funds, such that in FY24, 50% of the amount that should be allocated will be available. In FY25, 66.67% of the funds will be there. Other tweaks to the formula include increases in professional development for gifted students in both FY24 and 25. The transportation calculation has been changed slightly, such that the state share of minimum transportation costs are increasing to at least 37%, or 37.5% in the first year and 41.67% in the second year. The formula did, although this was changed throughout the process, but the formula does still contain the transition guarantee, which guarantees the district's fundings will not fall below the amount they received in FY21. And then the last piece that they did within the funding formula itself is that they increased the minimum state allocation from 5% to 10%. So as you're all aware, districts receive the amount of state funds based on an inverse relationship to their wealth. So we have districts currently that only receive 5% of the state aid from the state, and they provide the other 95% with local dollars. That now is going to increase at least a minimum of 10% will be state aid and 90% will be state dollars. So this will increase money to districts that are on the higher wealth end. The last thing I will say is that there was specific language put in on the state funding formula, which says that funding for FY26 and beyond is determined by the Ohio General Assembly. So just because we've kept it this far, don't be surprised if there are changes made in the formula moving forward. So it's something we're going to have to continue to watch. But for FY24 and FY25, the cut Patterson plan basically remains intact. Our funding formulas for the JVS, for the joint vocational schools, the community schools, STEM schools, and the ESCs also remain intact. There we go. Other things within the school funding formula to be aware of is that they are going to allow county auditors to correct property tax valuations for the FY21 tax year. If you are a district that this happens or had a reappraisal or a reassessment in 21, you may see some changes. The county auditors have 15 days after the effective date, which is October 3rd, to make the corrections. The department is then required to use those new computations in the computation of the formula, but any correction is not going to affect property taxes charged. Something else to be aware of is that if the district has a power plant and received a 10% or greater reduction on their tangible personal property tax, they are going to be eligible for an additional payment from the department. Those payments will come in June of 24 and then June of 25. Changes in gifted funding. So in the last budget cycle, there were some temporary changes made to gifted funding, and most of those temporary changes have been made permanent. So gifted funds are going to be restricted and only can be used for the identification of gifted students, coordinator services, gifted intervention specialists, Other specified special providers as approved by the department, and then professional development for gifted, for individuals working with gifted children. If a district fails to spend the money appropriately as audited by the department and the determination made by the department may reduce the district's state funding for that fiscal year by the amount of the misspent dollars. All of the reporting requirements that came into play in the last budget are now permanent, so you are going to have to annually report how your gifted funding is spent. Once those reports are put in place, the department is going to be required to annually publish data on services provided by the district, number of gifted intervention specialists that a district has, the number of coordinators the district has, and these are going to be reported in grade bands. The grade bands have been changed. So grade bands for gifted funding are going to move. Currently, they are K3, 4, 8, 9, 12. The new grade bands will be K2, 3, 6, 7, 8, and 9, 12. Gifted professional development funds are going to be calculated in a different way. And as I said, those were going to be increased in the funding formula. So it's such that they're going up per person or per student, $21 for fiscal year 24 and $28 for fiscal year 25. Transportation funding. There are also some additional changes in our transportation funding space. One of the requirements under the budget bill is that all school bus drivers are enrolled in RAPDAC. So there is $1 million in the budget to support the Department of Education and Workforce on RAPDAC. I will get into the transition of the department later. RAPDAC will probably stay with, I believe, the state board. So where that money is going to go, we'll have to wait and see. But bus drivers will now be enrolled in RAPDAC, and districts will have to make sure that that does occur. We are also increasing the dollar amount that is being set aside for special education transportation. There are some additional requirements on special education transportation, particularly for students who may be seeking their education in an alternative model, either in a non-chartered, non-public school or in a different school. You're going to now have to provide transportation services for those children if transportation services are identified on their IEP. And that may be a difference from what you've had in the past, or what you've had to do with regards to students who are on an IEP being educated in a different space. And then finally, the payment in lieu that you may be using to pay parents to transport children to an alternative education site now cannot be less than 50%. And not more than the average cost of pupil transportation as determined by the department. So some districts may have to increase what they have been paying parents for payment in lieu. Other districts may be forced to reduce some of that, some of those dollars. Disadvantaged pupil impact aid. So there are, as you all are aware, DPIA funds are restricted in how you can use them. And there have been some changes made to how those funds can be used. Currently, they can be used to extend the school year or the school day. That has not changed. Any changes or any programs that are focused on reading improvement and intervention will now be required to align with the science of reading and the evidence-based strategies for effective literacy instruction. So they're going to have to marry in with our move in reading to new curriculum and using the science of reading, not being able to use whole language or the 3 cueing approaches. So if you're using DPIA funds, even if it's for tutors or for some private assistance, all of those individuals are going to need to be using the science of reading as the foundation and not an alternative reading method to teach reading or literacy skills. Instructional technology and blended learning, there's no change in what you can use your DPIA funds on. Professional development, it does require that professional development in reading be aligned with the science of reading and evidence-based strategies for effective literacy and instruction. So anything that you're using in that space. Your dropout prevention, your safety measures, community learning centers that address those learning barriers to learning, academic interventions for students in grades 6 through 12, and employment of individuals who have successfully completed the Bright New Scholars or the Bright New Leaders program are all no change areas. So that if you're doing something in that space, you can continue to use your funds in that way, and there's no issue. Community based health providers are now a part of who you can spend mental health service dollars on. And then there's some changes with our student wellness dollars that are going to impact that in that space as well. But community health-based providers and community-based health service providers are both going to be areas both for mental and physical health that you're now going to be able to use DPIA funds to pay for services. If you are doing education or looking at programming that is currently using social and emotional learning curriculum to promote mental health and prevent substance use and suicide, the social and emotional health curricula, that language has been removed, and instead they have inserted trauma-informed services. So social and emotional learning is no longer going to be included, but trauma-informed services will be, and hopefully those will be fairly consistent so that you won't have to look for different programming in that space. Services for your homeless youth, there's no change. And also for services for children who are involved with the child welfare system, there's no change. Excuse me. Community liaisons and programs that connect students to community resources are going to continue, but they're going to add behavioral wellness coordinators as a possible liaison if you haven't currently had those in place. As I said, with the community-based mental health providers, community-based physical health providers will not be able to provide services. And then there's no change to any of the language around family engagement and support services or student services provided prior to a regularly scheduled school day. With the DPIA funding that is currently in place, and let me go to the second slide on it. That's kind of going through the exact changes as you see. There's also been changes to the student wellness dollars. So you're going to be required to spend all of your student wellness dollars on a select group of DPIA categories. And then at least 50% of your student wellness dollars have to be spent on DPIA categories of mental and physical health. So you're going to be limited in your student wellness dollars to only certain categories within DPIA, but of those categories, at least 50% of that money must be spent on services to assist with the physical and mental health of students. You're required to develop a plan on how you're going to be using your student wellness dollars. The plan and the categories for student wellness dollars are the mental health services. This can include telehealth services, community-based behavioral health services, and recovery supports. These programs must be culturally appropriate, evidence-based, or evidence-informed prevention education services, including youth-led programming and social and emotional learning curricula, or trauma-informed curricula to promote mental health and to prevent substance use and substance use and suicide. You can use this money for services for homeless youth, services for children involved in the child welfare system, and for community liaisons. The money can be used for physical healthcare services, including telehealth and community-based health appointments, and for family engagement and support services. So if you look, your DPIA funds can be used for before care, to extend the school year, for reading literacy. That is not something that your student wellness dollars can be used for. Your student wellness dollars can only be used on the subset of DPIA funds, and within that, 50% have to, again, be spent on your physical and mental health. So they're really trying to drive these student wellness dollars towards preventative care and mental health and physical health care for students. They're trying to encourage districts as much as possible to provide those services within the school day to those students who have been identified in need of those types of services. In a different space, the Ed Choice Scholarship, so for students who are not going to be attending your school, the state has increased and made the program basically a universal voucher program. It is going to be income-based. The eligibility for the program has been broadened. So anybody currently who is eligible to attend an Ohio school will be eligible to receive a scholarship of some amount. Up to 450% of the federal poverty level, the family is eligible for the entire amount. You can see the amounts this year. For children K-8, it is $6,165. For students, for children in grades 9 through 12, it's $8,407. That scholarship allocation is determined by the base rate, so it's a calculation off of the base rate that is contained within our school funding formula. Once we get above 450% of poverty, there's a means test that's involved, and the scholarship is reduced based on family's income. Now, you know, when it comes to, there's going to be some verification for family income. Individuals are going to have to choose to apply for the scholarship. They may have to provide for some financial verification of what their adjusted gross income is for W-2s. I'm sorry, for their tax returns. But that will then determine how much money they get. A child who has had a scholarship previously, or either being in a district that is on the Ed Choice list because of performance issues, or because they were below 250% of the federal poverty level, which is what our current level is, and have had a scholarship, their family is going to be able to request that a reassessment be done to determine if they are eligible for this new scholarship. So there's going to be a lot of changes going on for families within this program. I will tell you that we do know that private schools who receive these scholarship funds are already in contact with parents, explaining what they're going to have to do to take advantage of this new program, what they're going to have to file. The State Department of Education is in the process of trying to get all of this implemented going into the brand new school year. At the high end, and I did not mention this, but at the high end for individuals who are at, I believe it's 950% of the federal poverty level, they're going to be reduced and only be able to receive 10%. So they would only receive $617 on the scholarship. But the issue is everybody is eligible for something. So depending on families, well, a family of four makes $135,000 a year, is at 450% of the federal poverty level. So it's going to give you some idea of where people may fall with regards to these scholarships and being able to access them. Chartered non-public schools are allowed to charge a family above the 200% of the federal poverty level the balance owed on tuition. So if the tuition is $8,000 and the child gets a $6,165 voucher, the family can be charged the difference. But the law also allows scholarship entities to come in and pay that difference for them. So that will continue to occur. Certainly with some of our higher tuition institutions, some of our private Catholic high schools, especially, I know already are putting this in on their scholarship offer, and then offering scholarships on top of it to parents who are wanting to send their child to a private school. So this will be implemented. It is effective immediately, and then we will see it continue to be implemented over the next 2 years. It is funded off of a separate line item. So this is not money that's coming to you as a public school district, and then you're going to be sending out. This is money that is sent specifically from a different line item to the parents and the school involved, so that local dollars are not going towards the Ed Choice scholarship selections. Five-year forecasts. There was language put in. I am assuming most of you are aware of House Bill 1, which was the bill which would have said we're going to eliminate. We're going to make wholesale changes to local property taxes. And one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to flatten the income tax. And the state is going to pay for that income tax flattening by eliminating the $1 billion in rollbacks that the state is providing to localities who charge property tax for the 920 payments, along with homestead exemption and other payments that the state makes to act as a stopgap when they have made changes to state or to local property tax law. So oftentimes we'll see when tangible personal property, as we're seeing with the assessment for the power plants, as that money goes down, sometimes the state will come in and say, okay, we're gonna act and pay the district the difference, so that the district is held harmless to these outside forces that are changing their revenue streams. What this provision does is this requires your treasurer, as they're making the 5-year forecasts, to split out your rollback payment and label that rollback payment as the state share of local property taxes. So the payment that they receive for the property tax rollback because of 920, the homestead exemption, the tangible personal property tax that they may be receiving from the state, all of that money is going to have to be separately allocated and accounted for on the forecast and labeled as the state share. So that is being highlighted. So treasurers are going to need to be aware of this moving forward as they make those 5-year forecasts. Earmark accountability is a program. Many of our schools or our civic organizations will have earmarks in the state education budget that allow them to provide additional services to a district or to a district's population. So one of the best examples I can think of is the Boys and Girls Club. I believe Cleveland and Columbus both receive an allocation from the state budget to provide after-school services for students in those areas. What this is going to be required, what this earmark accountability is doing, is saying that if you are receiving one of these special earmarks within the state education budget, you're going to have to provide a report to the Department of Education and Workforce that says the following. It's a description of exactly what services were paid for by these funds. It's a description of results achieved by the services which were provided, analysis of the effectiveness of the programs, and an opinion as to whether the program could be moved to another district. And again, this is, you may have a program like a Boys and Girls Club, which is providing services, and you may be paying for some of the services with BPAA funds, but they may have gotten an earmark to pay for additional services above and beyond. And what they're really looking for here is did these funds get spent? What did they get spent on? What were the results? And is there any way we could take that program maybe from Cleveland or from Columbus and apply it to Akron or Toledo or Cincinnati? So they're really looking for that type of information. And we have several of these programs within the budget. Your Boys and Girls Clubs are by far not the only one that receive this funding. There's quite a few of them that are listed. And what I will say is, if you are involved with a program that does get this type of earmark, be aware that if you fail to provide this report to the department can withhold funds in the future until everything within this report is filed and they are satisfied with what is going on in that space. Flexible funding for families and children. Some of you may have children in your district that have pretty significant struggles in their lives. They may have significant mental health challenges, behavioral challenges, those types of things, and educating them within the public school, your local public school is not practical. And what we have found is sometimes these children have to be placed in alternative facilities. These are children typically that are involved across multiple state agencies. They can be involved with child welfare. They may be on a Medicaid recipient type program, or they may be a Medicaid recipient, but they may be on a program such as with the state having custody. There's dollars that can pay for residential treatment. They may have a pretty significant mental health challenge, and there's money within mental health and addiction services to cover them. But what we have found currently is that it's difficult because these programs are very expensive, and the pots of money to pay for them that allow the child to be provided all of the services they need come from very different areas, including our school districts. And nobody was able to have the contracting authority because they couldn't contract for money that they weren't going to be paying. And so there was no way to allow these children to easily be enrolled in these programs and to have somebody sign the contract and pool all the money together from all of the different programs to pay for it. And that's what this provision is going to allow. So it's going to allow money to be transferred to a flexible funding pool created by a county family and children's first council to provide provisions of services to these children's and to these families and children. You may be asked to help fund this in some way. If you have a child, like I said, who has significant needs, probably is on an IEP or a 504 because of behavioral issues, and would allow you to contribute a portion of what is needed to provide the child with the wholesale services that they need. This slide is on there as much as anything to make sure that you're aware that this is an opportunity should you be in a situation where you're trying to figure out how to provide services for a child and don't know how. This is an option potentially for you to investigate. The Ohio College Opportunity Grant Program. This program, which is truly in the higher education space, is an automatic scholarship that Ohio students receive who are going to in-state schools. What they did is they increased the eligibility when a family fills out the financial aid form, the FAFSA, that we're all probably very familiar with. A family contribution is allocated, and prior to this change, if a family had a contribution level of $2,190 or below, they qualified for this grant program, and they received an award to attend an in-state school. What they have done is increased the threshold from $2,190 to $3,750. So a family now who can afford up to the $3,750 level will also be able to participate in this program. So it will greatly expand the number of students who will be eligible for the Opportunity Grant Program. This is something to be aware of for your guidance counselors as they're helping students try to figure out how they're going to pay for college and making sure that family fills the FAFSA out to see if they will hit at this income level. There were several provisions within the budget, little pots of money that we wanted to make sure you were aware of. There's $600,000 in the budget, which is to pay for advanced placement and college level examination program test costs for those students whose household income is at or below the statewide median. And again, they're really trying to encourage our children who may be at the lower end of the income, families who are at the lower end of the income levels, to be able to participate in our AP courses. Those courses can be very expensive, as we all are aware. I think it's $100 per test at this point in time. And this is going to be a pot of money that can be used to help those children participate, rather than you charging that fee to the family. You're going to be able to access dollars in this space. And as I'm sure most of you are aware, the Ohio Department of Education is going through a reorganization. This started last fall in November, when the Senate at the time introduced legislation which was going to move the State Department, most of the responsibilities for the State Department, over to the governor's office and have it be a cabinet level position within the administration, with the governor appointing a director of education. It did not happen during the lame duck session that we all went through last December. And the Senate, who has been the primary proponent of this change, rolled it into the budget during their part of budget negotiations, during their time when they evaluated it and rewrote the budget bill. This reorganization was included. So what this does is it splits the Ohio Department of Education into two agencies. The Department of Education and Workforce, which is now going to be known as DO, and the State Board of Education. And one of the things I want to say is this does not mean that they are going to fire the entire Department of Education. If you're employed at the Department of Education, you probably will not see much of a change at all in what you are currently doing. It's really more going to change what strand, if you're a tree, what limb you're going to go up as you go higher into the hierarchy of the organization. Most of the duties that our state board currently has, so decisions around curriculum, around programming, student wellness dollars, Medicaid in the schools, transportation, all of those services that our state board currently has, and including the responsibilities for writing the administrative rules around gifted education, special education, as I said, curriculum, graduation requirements. All of those provisions now are going to shift over to the governors, to the department under the governor. The State Board of Education is going to be required to have territory control, licensure, and discipline on licensees. And I'll get into that more on the next slide. The department is going to be split into two areas. It's going to have one area that is K-12 education, and the second that is career technical education. The director of the department, along with the deputy director of each of those two arms, are going to be appointed by the governor, and will be approved. The director shall be approved by the Senate, as is common for all gubernatorial appointees. The Division of Primary and Secondary Education then will be the area that you primarily interact with. It's where EMIS is going to live. It's where, as I was saying, graduation requirements, all of the requirements with the school report cards, all of those issues are going to fall under this Department of Education and Workforce. Now, if the governor, when the governor leaves office, and he is term limited after 2026, and we get a new governor in place, you could see a quicker change in state policies That is something that people have pointed to as being a concern. We'll have to see how this plays out. It's certainly what the governor was wanting, and the Senate was wanting when they moved these policies over to the governor. They felt that the department, that the State Board of Education was too unwieldy, too unable to get things done in an efficient manner, and that we were waiting for months for decisions to happen, with a lot of children left hanging in the balance. So, you know, people are very concerned about reading scores. We've not caught up. We've seen a significant loss in learning, particularly in our primary grades. Our third grade reading scores are very low compared to what they were pre-pandemic. And kind of the hit to the State Board of Education is you can't get a superintendent hired, let alone how are you going to address these challenges with learning that our primary kids are seeing, and these falling test scores. So in theory, this new department is going to be able to react more quickly, implement strategies, change administrative rules, or get rules promulgated more quickly than our state board that only meets 2 or 3 days, 1 week a month. We'll have to continue to see how this plays out. All of the funding that was allocated to the department, all of our GRF funding has gone with the department over to the gubernatorial cabinet level department. The licensure funding has stayed with the State Board of Education. The other issue with this is this division of career technical education. They're really trying to increase the state funds and people paying attention to career and technical education in the state of Ohio. We have a tremendous number of jobs that are open, that are programs that are credentialed, but they don't require a 4-year degree. And how are we going to get people trained into those positions? And so they wanted to elevate tech education in the state, and they believe this is one way to do that. So I do think within the first year, year and a half, 2 years, as everybody gets settled, you will see several new initiatives in the career tech space, and resources allocated towards career tech education that we haven't seen previously, as a nod to the fact that encouraging children all to go to a 4-year college probably is not in the best interests of the state or of the children involved. There are a lot of people who need to be looking at alternatives to post education employment other than just a 4-year degree. So we'll see how this plays out with this career tech moving forward. So as I said, the State Board of Education is going to be involved in education licensure, disciplinary actions, and school board territory transfers. They also will still have the state superintendent of public instruction. So they have put out a request. They hired a search firm, and they are looking for a state the superintendent of public instruction. I'll be interested to see how many people apply for this position, given that it is now only going to have action over these 3 limited areas. I will also be curious to see whether there is a move to remove the gubernatorial appointments to the state board. Remember that the governor has 9 appointments or 8 appointments. There are 11 elected positions, and that allows the governor to have say in this. I'll be interested to see whether they remove those appointed positions now that the governor has the department under his purview. Currently, the challenge is going to be there was no GRF money allocated for the State Board of Education to operate. Now, we have a lot of state boards, state licensure boards. We have the nursing board, the medical board, the pharmacist board, et cetera, in the state, and they are all solely operated by licensure fees. The challenge will be that with RAPBAC and some other programs that the department is required, or that the State Board of Education now will be required to operate, that do not include licensees, but fall under this purview, how they're going to fund all of that programming. So whether they will increase licensure fees, what those costs are going to look like, I don't think anybody has a real good idea as of yet. And what they're going to do about things like RAPBAC. There was $1 million allocation for RAPBAC, but what they're going to do with that, where that's going to live and how that's going to operate, will be seeded over the next year to 18 months as this transition occurs. So with that, I finished about 15 minutes early. And
Sherri, why don't we jump into the questions now? I see
Okay.
there's 3 questions in the Q&A box. And I would encourage anyone else, if anyone has a question that they haven't submitted yet, please go ahead and do so. But why don't we go ahead and move to the questions? Let's see. So first question is it just bus drivers that need to go into wrap back, or also nutrition and others without pupil contact? So I know, Sherri, you touched on this in terms of drivers needing, being expanded into the wrap back system. I have a slide on this in our part 2. And it's all non-licensed employees that are now subject to wrap back. So under existing law, they were subject to an initial background check, but now they will be in the wrap back system. And there is the notification requirement that districts will receive notice if something hits in that system of those employees. So it's not just limited to drivers.
Are contractors for those types of positions included? Susan or Sherri, do you know in the wrap back, are contractors included in that or not?
So I think that there is an argument that they are. If you look at the statutory language, it just says persons who are not required to hold a license. It doesn't use the term employees. So I believe if I would argue that if you have a contracted employee, for instance, that they would need to go into wrap back as well. And Lisa, if you have thoughts otherwise, please, obviously feel free to share.
No, I agree with that. I think especially for contracted folks that are working directly with students, I think the argument becomes that much stronger. So I do agree with that interpretation.
Sure, right. Okay, then our second question is, am I right in assuming that even though the scholarship money does not come out of our foundation funding, the money will still come out of our funding because we will no longer be paid for that student if they leave. So the end result of lost funds would be the exact same. Sherri, I think I'm going to toss that one to you.
So yes and no. By funding, we had districts prior to the scholarships being split to a separate line item. We had districts, because they were not receiving 100% of the funds from the state, they had their state share. They were paying out more in the scholarships than what they were receiving from the state for that student. So that issue, that phantom revenue issue, was addressed by splitting out the line item to a separate line item so that the money is not coming from the district. Certainly, if the student isn't being counted in your count, you are not getting the money for that student that you would have gotten had the student been attending your school. The state's argument is going to be that it's not a loss of funds to you because you're not providing educational services to that student. Now, I do need to do some digging. I had somebody ask me recently, what happens if that student enrolls in the district, say in November? So if you're counting in October, you submit your count, and then in November, the parent decides to pull that child back. What happens with the allocation of that scholarship money? And does that money stay with the private school that is no longer educating the child? Or is that money somehow going to be gotten back and allocated to the district? And I've not had the opportunity, like I said, that was a question asked of me this morning. I've not had an opportunity to look at that, but that's something that we can look at and get back to all of you, is what that's going to look like. Because certainly it does not, there seems to be some issue if an individual has accepted a scholarship, has enrolled in a private school, and leaves that private school for whatever reason, that private school should not be able to retain the balance of the scholarship money. But what that looks like, I don't know, and it's something we'll have to look at and get back to you on.
Thank you for that, Sherri. It does sound like some creative packaging, from the state in terms of trying to sell that it's not a loss of funding when, clearly you're not, if the student is going elsewhere, you're not getting those dollars. So, okay, and thank you, Tom, for that question. And then we have a third question. So the Ed Choice scholarships provide at least 10% of the base scholarship without any means testing on the high end of family incomes.
So I need to look at that language. It is the high-end families, which is above, I believe it's 950% of the federal poverty level, are guaranteed at least 10% of the scholarship money. Now, currently scholarship money can only go to chartered non-public schools. I will tell you that during the budget debate, there was conversation about scholarship money being able to go to non-chartered non-public schools. And typically our non-chartered non-public schools are schools more in the realm of a religious-based school, where they don't want to have any influence from the state with regards to what they're teaching students or how they're teaching students. And so they choose not to be chartered by the state, hence the non-chartered. But there was a lot of concern about whether or not scholarship money could go to pay for tuition at these schools. And given that they haven't chosen to be chartered, they haven't gone through that paperwork, there was a lot of concern about just sending the money there. So that language was removed and they can't do that. I do think that's potentially something that we will see in the future. And where I would really expect to see it potentially is under some arguments that you have some homeschooled families who live close to each other that want to provide a co-op or form a co-op or a new school, and then apply for scholarship money to be homeschooling their children. This scholarship money right now is not allocated. Homeschool children are not eligible for it. So a parent can't say, I'm going to homeschool my child. I have 3 children, therefore give me $18,000. Although under one of the versions of the bill, the scholarship bill, the voucher bill that's introduced in the House, that was what was going to happen. That is not what came through in this legislation or in this language. But I think there's some concern about that happening in the future also, which is another reason to keep the non-chartered, non-public schools out. But with regards to, there is language about what type of financial documents can be required to provide income or to prove income. They are to be limited and they are non-public. So they are exempt from the open records law, but they do have to be able to verify where they are in the income level, and then they will be able to receive the scholarship. And if they are at the higher end, they are guaranteed at least 10%.
Okay, thank you, Sherri, for that information. And we do have one more question, which is, will you be making the handouts available? And prior to the webinar, we did get a question submitted about whether this webinar was being recorded. So yes, we will have the handouts available, and this webinar is being recorded. And so after the webinar, you will receive an email from us that will have a link to our handouts, and it will also have a link to the recording. And you will be able to also find the recording on our website, Roetzel and Anderson website, which is ralaw.com. Okay, welcome everyone. Just wanted to take a moment to make sure I could move among the slides, but we are back now for part 2 of our webinar on the final provisions of House Bill 33, the budget bill. As I mentioned when we got started earlier, this part will address the non-funding provisions that, even though they don't have a direct or primary funding component, certainly have a lot of impact on school districts and their programming and staffing and personnel and that sort of thing. So as a reminder, this part is scheduled for 1 hour. So it will run till about 3:30. And we have reserved 15 minutes after that for questions. If you have any questions, please drop those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And as I mentioned in part 1, we are recording this webinar, so it will be available to you on our website. And afterwards, you will also receive a link in your email with both the slides and the a link to the recording of the webinar. So with that, we are going to go ahead and get started on part 2. Okay, so this is mentioned a little bit in part 1 but if we have any attendees that did not participate in part 1, you know, the House Bill 33 was signed into law by Governor DeWine on July 4th. And so the appropriations that are part of House Bill 33 were effective that same day, July 4th, 2023. But the other provisions are effective October 3rd of this year, unless otherwise specified in the bill. So a lot of what we're talking about in this part will be effective October 3rd, although there's some murkiness to that date as it applies to certain areas. So the first big component of the budget bill is an increase in annual teacher salary. So this increases it from existing law, which is the base salary in existing law is $30,000. In the budget bill, it's been increased to $35,000. And again, that's for a base salary. And then it also increases the salary to $36,330 for teachers with 5 years of training, but no master's degree. And then it increases it to $38,325 for teachers with a master's degree or higher. And I should just make mention that that $35,000 is for teachers with just a bachelor's degree as the base salary. The salary steps in the statute, and this provision lives in Ohio Revised Code 33-1713. So the existing salary steps in that statute do not change in terms of the percentage differentials, but the actual figures have been changed in the statutory language to reflect the impact of the increase of base salary. And those percentage differentials in the existing steps range from about 3.5% to 4.8% differential as you go through the schedule. Those of you that have been following House Bill 33 may remember that there was the House version of the bill did propose to increase the base salary to $40,000. That would have had a much larger impact, as it was estimated during the bill process. It was estimated that at $40,000 that there would be 16,800 teachers affected that were currently below the $40,000 threshold of base salary based on fiscal year 2022 data. So at the reduced amount of $35,000 for base salary, that's about 3,400 teachers that are effective, and that's about a $9.3 million estimated cost to bring those teachers up to the new increased base salary. And you know, I'm surmising that this is probably going to impact your local school districts the most, who have teachers that are probably a little bit lower than that in their collective bargaining agreements. Certainly, this is going to have bargaining impact. Now, this is one that does have an effective date of October, but I know Lisa Burleson mentioned to me that one of our clients has already received a demand to bargain from, I think it was OEA, because their teachers are below their base salary in that particular school district. So I think you're going to be seeing that a lot. If you have your base salary that's under $35,000, you're going to be getting demands to bargain that from your unions and associations. And you know, obviously, the increasing the base salary not only increases the salary schedule as we see in the statutory language, but it also can have an impact on the cost of your supplementals, other stipends that might be based on minimum teacher salary or base salary. So you're going to want to take a look at your collective bargaining agreements if you haven't already, to see if you're below that $35,000 now in base, to see how far ranging the impact of that increase may go in your district in terms of components that are impacted and what the financial cost of that would be. Okay, I'm going to flip it to Lisa for sports gaming tax.
So the final version of the budget bill imposes changes to our current law, revised code 5705.031, which currently requires that 50% of the funds in the sports gaming profits education fund be used to support interscholastic athletics and other extracurricular activities for students enrolled in K-12. Currently, that same statute indicates that the other 50% of the sports gaming profits education fund that's not used to support interscholastic athletics and extracurriculars be used for general support. The governor's version of the budget did not contain a provision addressing this at all. The House sought in their version to limit the 50% expenditure requirement for athletics and extracurriculars to the lesser of a specified dollar amount or 50%. And the Senate in final versions of the bill eliminates the 50% expenditure requirement entirely as it pertains to athletics and extracurriculars. And so now generally the sports gaming tax revenue can be used for general support purposes. Moving now to the next slide on College Credit Plus. There is a new provision in the bill that requires auxiliary funds to be used to establish a grant program for school districts to offer new CCP courses taught in secondary schools by high school teachers who have appropriate credentials. This grant is not for existing CCP courses, and it's also not for CCP taught at higher ed. The grant funds are specifically for new CCP courses taught in secondary schools by high school teachers who have appropriate credentials. It's interesting to note that neither the governor's version nor the House contained a provision addressing this. So this was actually introduced by the Senate. And the grant program will require that at least $1,000 be used for each new qualifying course. Again, that's a secondary course in a secondary school taught by a high school teacher. And at least 25% of the funds must be used to pay the high school teachers that are teaching these new classes. So as we can imagine, this will have collective bargaining and implications, not only for those districts that already have CCP provisions in their collective bargaining agreements, but for districts that don't. It's fair game. The language is clear that there is a requirement to pay high school teachers who teach these new secondary school courses. Along with this, DO, which is a new Department of Education and Workforce, is required to prioritize these grants to districts who, one, lack advanced standing courses, and two, to districts with low CCP participation rates. The budget language is not clear, or it doesn't define advanced standing courses or what is considered low CCP participation rates, but the budget is also clear that DO is required to establish guidelines and procedures for the new program. So we'll just kind of wait and see what transpires. But just knowing that this is on the horizon is something we definitely need to have on our to-do list for the coming school year. Going to the next slide, still on the subject of CCP. There was a specific fiscal year allocation to DO and the Department of Higher Ed to provide awards to support graduate coursework for high school teachers to receive credentialing to teach CCP. So again, another topic that's going to be, I think we can use the word hot for collective bargaining this year and perhaps for years to come. And priority for these funds for the graduate coursework for high school teachers to receive credentialing for CCP, priority will be given to economically disadvantaged high schools in which there are limited or no teachers that currently have such credentials. So CCP, a good focus in the budget bill this year.
Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so switching gears to the Military Veterans Educator Program. So this is a program that it was announced last year on Veterans Day of 2022. And it's a program really designed to assist military veterans and their spouses who have a desire to transition into the education world. And so what the budget bill this year does is it earmarks $3,225,000 in each fiscal year to support the military veterans program. And it requires the program to establish grants to provide financial incentives and assistance to military individuals, again, and that can include their spouses, to enroll in or to complete educator prep programs. It also requires a subsidy of costs for military individuals completing college coursework or professional development in order to obtain an alternative military educator license. That alternative military educator license is something that we're going to talk about a couple slides later. That was also addressed in House Bill 33 as well, as kind of, again, part of this focus on trying to capture some of those military veterans into our staffing resources for school districts. And then the bill also does require the reimbursement for schools who pay bonuses to eligible military individuals who complete 1 year of employment. So, obviously that's a funding aspect that, in terms of a school being able to get reimbursement for bonuses paid, but that's certainly going to implicate bargaining if if your district is interested in paying bonuses to those individuals. I think that you're going to hear your unions wanting to weigh in on that, certainly. And if you're mid-contract and you want to implement a bonus, then you are going to be looking at midterm bargaining that. If you're heading into negotiations, this is something to think about whether or not it's something that needs to be addressed at the table, depending on what your plans are. So that's certainly something to keep in mind as you move into your bargaining season. Okay, and again, kind of in the same category of earmarked funds for specific programs. The House Bill 33 does earmark $5,500,000 in each fiscal year to support payments to public schools whose students earn an industry recognized credential or journeyman certificate. And it also earmarks money for the Innovative Workforce Incentive Program, where DO will pay $1,000, $250 for each credential earned in the preceding year. So this is, this is a focus on bringing more emphasis into trades, into, the schooling programs that are being offered. We will see this theme in terms of focusing on increased opportunities for students in trades. We'll see this later in the presentation as well, relating to some school counselor training that's now required as well. But the House Bill 33 does also require that schools inform students of the opportunity to earn the credential of a journeyman certificate or other industry recognized credential. And it does specify that the school must pay the cost of the credential, but the school can apply for reimbursement for that cost up to 6 months after the student has graduated. And then there is also some funding earmarked for students that participate in at least 250 hours of work-based learning under this program. Okay, I'll move it to Lisa.
So the next few slides address the reduced price lunch meal program, and then the next slide we will address the school meal program allocation in general. But under the final version of the budget, for those districts that participate in the National School Breakfast or Lunch Program, school breakfast and lunch will now be free for all students who are eligible or otherwise eligible for a reduced price meal. So this provision will apply again to all districts that participate in the National School Breakfast or Lunch Program. This is not a free meal for all provision. It applies to those students who are eligible for or otherwise eligible for a reduced price meal. And so the House actually introduced this portion into the budget bill, and the Senate did not modify it at all. And the provision here applies to STEM schools, as well as buildings operated by ESCs and facilities offering juvenile day treatment services. So there is some universal application. And our next slide on school meal programs. This actually was from the governor's budget, and the proposal, which was passed, allocates $13.1 million for matching funds to obtain federal funds for school lunch program and to provide reimbursements to districts who are now required to provide free breakfast and lunch to those students who are eligible or otherwise eligible for reduced price meals.
Okay, moving on to the subject of transportation. This is a biggie. This relates to non-compliance for student transportation, for the state law requirements for student transportation. And this kind of is born out of, you know, the disputes that occurred last year with Cincinnati Public Schools and Dayton, where ODE was deducting funding for their non-compliance, for their, you know, inability to be able to transport students within the requirements of existing laws. So, and the final provisions of this portion of it really is kind of an amalgamation of what was proposed in the House version and what was proposed in the Senate version. There were some key provisions that were dropped from both of those versions that I'm going to point out that I think were a good thing that they got dropped. But essentially what House Bill 33 does is it changes kind of the structure of how districts will be held accountable for non-compliance with student transportation requirements. So instead of funds being deducted, they will be withheld. So future payments will not be provided, and DO will notify the district of non-compliance, and the district will have 1 week to submit a corrective action plan. And we'll talk about what non-compliance is under these provisions. But then if there's the next 3 occurrences of non-compliance under the bill, DO will then withhold 25% of the district's daily transportation payment for that period of time. And then if you get to a 5th occurrence of non-compliance, DO will withhold 100% of payment for each day that district is out of compliance. So what does out of compliance mean? So what this bill did is it did drop the existing law standard of consistent or prolonged period of noncompliance, and that was defined in existing law as either 10 consecutive days of noncompliance or 10 days in 1 semester. So that definition is dropped, that no longer applies. And so what out of compliance or non-compliance now means is it's defined as 5 consecutive school days or more than 10 days within a school year in which any of the following occur. Students arrive more than 30 minutes late to school, or they are picked up more than 30 minutes after the end of the school day, or they receive no student transportation at all, or there's always the little catch-all language of, or there's just non-compliance with any other student transportation requirements. So again, you know, if you have 5 consecutive school days or 10 days within a school year where any of those things occur, you're either dropping off students 30 minutes late to school, or you're picking them up 30 minutes late at the end of the school day, or you're not providing transportation at all, that can trigger DO. Still getting used to the acronym, that can trigger DO to notify the district of non-compliance. The district will then have to submit a corrective action plan. And then if there's, you know, up to 3 more occurrences of non-compliance, then that's when you start seeing those funds being withheld. Now, there is an inclement weather exception. So if, you know, if the non-compliance is due to inclement weather, then you're not going to get dinged. But there's no other exemptions for other things that were kind of talked about as this bill was percolating, such as construction, traffic accidents, that sort of thing. So just keep that in mind. 2 key components that were dropped from the prior versions of the bill was that the House version had a requirement that school districts, is specifically said school districts had to provide substantially the same level of transportation service to students attending non-public or community schools, and it went into, you know, kind of same level as specified, same level of in terms of routes, start times, end times, that sort of thing. That was dropped from the final bill provision, and then also dropped from the Senate version was the requirement that your JVS within your district or the community and charter non-public schools would have to approve any change to your school calendar. So I think thankfully that provision was also dropped from the final bill. But, obviously, in the last few years, certainly since COVID, but even starting before that, it's been very difficult for the districts that I work with to maintain adequate transportation, staffing, drivers, aides, all of it. Certainly very difficult to get substitutes. And, that's when these issues arise, when you don't, if you don't have enough drivers to do all of your routes, then that's when you're making the announcements at the end of the school day that routes are being reconfigured or combined and that sort of thing. So I think that, with this increased focus by DO on non-compliance, districts are going to be having to really take a hard look at their staffing, at their subbing resources. This also can implicate, certainly overtime if you're, keeping drivers longer to make sure that you stay in compliance. And discipline, if you have a bus driver that's kind of your, at the top of your list of calling off for reasons that seem suspicious, you may be having to take a closer look at disciplining, that driver to, make sure that the staff that you do have in place that should be adequate, it is actually there and able to drive the bus and get these students, where they need to be. And then certainly, I know a lot of issues arise out of, mandatory route assignments, what a district can do or cannot do when you have a driver that calls off. Can you require another driver to take that route? Is it just open up to other drivers voluntarily? A lot of that's governed by your collective bargaining agreement. And where that's silent, then that would implicate your management right. But those are all things that you're going to, be having to take a look at in regards to this to make sure that you stay on the right side of compliance. Okay. Also on the subject of transportation, just a quick note for those of you that received funding through the school bus purchase in fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23. You are now able to use those funds through 2025, and I think that's largely to address supply chain issues. And then that can even be extended by due as well. Okay, and I'm going to toss it to Lisa.
Okay, on the next two slides, we're going to touch on the subject of reading. We're going to see it again later in the materials, but the next two slides touch on the governor's proposal, which was titled Literacy Improvement. In the governor's version of the budget. So there are several components that we'll want to pay attention to on this in particular, on the subject of reading. And the first of which is for FY24, there's $60.4 million earmarked to subsidize school districts purchase of ODE approved curriculum and instructional materials in the science of reading and evidence-based strategies for effective literacy instruction. So those materials, of course, have not yet been developed, but they will be required to be purchased and then, of course, rolled out starting in FY24. And as part of this, there's been an earmark of $43 million in each fiscal year of the budget for stipends to pay teachers to complete PD courses in reading. Again, the PD courses have to be aligned with the content on science of reading and evidence-based strategies for effective literacy instruction. And there is a deadline at the bottom of the slide there, July 30 of 2025, so essentially 2 years from today. All teachers and administrators must complete the course in the science of reading and evidence-based strategies for effective literacy instruction, unless those individuals have already completed a similar course. Now, The budget bill does not define what the term similar course means, so we'll have to stay tuned on that. But as of now, the way the budget bill was adopted, all teachers and administrators must complete the course by about 2 years from today, July 30, 2025, unless they've already completed a similar course. On the next slide, we see the amount of the stipends set forth for teachers who teach different subjects and grade levels. So the way the final version of the budget bill shook out, districts must pay stipends of $1,200 to teachers of grades K through 5, ELA, teachers grades 6 through 12, intervention specialists, English learner teachers, reading specialists, and instructional coaches. And then districts will be required to pay $400 to teachers of subjects other than ELA in grades 6 through 12. In the notes in the final version of the budget, it does indicate that ODE will be required to reimburse school districts for payment of these stipends, but ODE will not be able to reimburse districts for any stipends paid to administrators to complete these PD courses. The notes in the budget bill and the final version also indicate that the first tier there, the $1,200 stipend teachers, all of those folks are supposed to be given first priority in taking the courses, followed then by the $400 stipend teachers, and then administrators are last. And then another note that's really important that was in the notes in the final version of the bill, LPDCs will be required to count these courses towards PD requirements for teacher license renewal, and LPDCs will be able to permit a teacher to roll over any hours earned from these courses that are over the minimum amount of hours required for PD for licensure renewal to the next renewal period. So certainly something to keep in mind as LPDCs are starting perhaps to regather for the new school year and look forward, and also something to keep in mind to the extent there's collective bargaining implications in regards to the payment of these stipends and the timing of same. And then our next slide is on the subject of adaptive sports program, and this is a singular slide. There are more than just this one slide that address this, but in the final version of the budget bill, there's an earmark of $250,000 in each fiscal year to be used by DO to collaborate with the Adaptive Sports Program of Ohio to fund adaptive sports programs in school districts across the state. The governor's version of the budget did not contain a provision for this. The Senate introduced it, and the line item doesn't contain a great amount of detail, but the focus appears to be on ensuring that middle school and high school students with physical disabilities in particular have opportunities for participation in interscholastic athletics at school. Currently, the Adaptive Sports Program of Ohio does have programs and a presence in the state, but this particular line item in the budget will require DO to collaborate with the Adaptive Sports Program of Ohio to just kind of ensure a more kind of a universal approach to the programming. Next, accountability and report cards. This is straight from the governor's budget. There are funds that are to be used to train specialists and educators in the use of value-added progress dimension and the use of data as it relates to improving student achievement. Funds in this particular area of the budget can also be used for teacher and administrator PD. in the use of data to improve instruction and student learning and understanding teacher value added reports. And then next slide on EMIS. There is a line item of $405,000 in each fiscal year to support grants to information technology centers for PD and EMIS. The PD is supposed to be offered for district and school personnel, and the focus of the PD is supposed to be on data submission and data quality. This is a provision that came straight from the governor's budget proposal. And in the notes on the proposal, there are provisions for funding specific to developing data definitions and standards outlined in EMIS guidelines. And I think everybody can universally agree that that will be helpful. And then there's also a provision in the line item that addresses the implementation of recommendations from the EMIS Advisory Council and the state superintendent. So again, this portion came straight from the governor's proposal, and there weren't any additions, deletions, or modifications from the legislature on this.
Okay, next, there is a provision in the bill relating to feminine hygiene products, and it requires that any districts that serve grades 6 through 12 are required to provide free feminine hygiene products to students in those grades. And it does earmark $5 million in fiscal year 24 to provide to districts. $2 million of that is to install dispensers, and $3 million is to reimburse districts for the feminine hygiene products themselves. And then any money beyond that in future years are the responsibility of the district. So just a couple of things about this. It is optional if districts want to also provide these products to students in grades, below 6th grade. And it is up to the district to decide where they want to, how they want to provide this. Do they want to, for instance, install dispensers in the student bathrooms? Do you want to make them accessible to students through the nurse's office? That sort of thing. Those are the kind of things to think about. For those districts that have unisex bathrooms, then it becomes the question is, do you install the dispensers in a unisex bathroom or not? So those are just kind of the considerations. The Ohio Revised Code provision that addresses this is 3313-6413. Okay, so another biggie, in my mind anyways, is blizzard bags. So the budget bill gets rid of blizzard bags. So districts are no longer permitted to use blizzard bags to make up, school hours for calamity days. Instead, districts have to adopt a plan by August 1st of each school year for making up calamity days through a virtual education model. So this is kind of, smacks of what you all just went through, during the pandemic in terms of providing education services remotely to your students. And this model that's now required in lieu of blizzard bags, it can be used to make up a maximum of 3 school days. The provisions of the bill are pretty specific in terms of what your plan must be. And I think one key to keep in mind is that it does require that the plan include teacher-directed synchronous learning during the calamity days. So, and it also requires that the plan include teachers and students interacting in real time on a virtual learning platform during the school day. So this isn't, go on Google Classroom, students, and complete, certain, 30 minutes of Kahoots math or something like that. This is teacher-directed real-time learning that the plan is required to provide during these calamity days. And then the plan is also required to address attendance requirements and how districts will document the students' participation in learning opportunities. It also has to describe how the district will ensure equitable access to the instruction for students that have disabilities or for English learner students and other vulnerable student populations. So again, all all things that you all had to grapple with, right, during the pandemic. And then the plan also does have to include the process by which parents can get in touch with teachers during the school day, either by phone or email during the closure. It also has to address how parents or how staff and students and parents will be notified during the Calamity Day regarding how to access the online delivery and that the online delivery of instruction will be used. And then finally, it does require a district to address how it will meet the technology needs of staff and students who, to ensure that they're able to connect, to this online programming during the Calamity Days. So, and again, the bill requires each year by August 1st, the district has to submit this plan to do for approval. If you do that, then it again can be used to make up a maximum of 3 school days. There is some question as to whether or not this component of the bill became effective July 4th when it was signed, or is effective in October with the other provisions of the bill that have a later effective date. I mean, August 1st is tomorrow. Obviously, I'm not aware of even one district that has something like this up and running, ready to be submitted. So I think we're going to have to kind of take a watch and see outlook on that. But I certainly do encourage all of you administrators out there that are listening to start thinking about this and start putting some plans in place to address the requirement. Okay. And Lisa will talk about cash payments at school events.
The only thing I would add, Susan, I mean, I think you would probably also want administrators who are listening to be in contact with teachers unions, support staff unions, in terms of developing these plans, noting that August 1st is tomorrow. Like you said, I can't imagine anybody has these up and running, ready to click submit tomorrow, but definitely something to be working on and collaborating with the unions on.
Absolutely. I thank you, Lisa, because I failed to mention that, but this obviously has a lot of bargaining implications. I mean, I think every collective bargaining agreement that I work within has Calamity Day provisions. Some of those require teachers, for instance, to report in school, even when a Calamity Day is called, which, if you have that might make this the teacher directed learning a little bit easier to implement. But for those of you that don't require your teachers to report in person on a Calamity Day, that's a different challenge. And some collective bargaining agreements don't have teachers working on Calamity Days at all. And so that's absolutely something that you're going to have to be addressing with your unions in terms of any changes that will be required.
Now, this next slide, no collective bargaining implications that I can really think of, but it's definitely one of the provisions in the budget that's getting a lot of buzz because it almost seems, I guess it's fair to say, at least for our school treasurers who might be listening, like we are taking a step backwards in time rather than a step forwards, because during the COVID era and a lot of the challenges that were presented at that time, a lot of districts moved to entirely online systems for ticket sales as well as concessions. And this particular provision in the budget bill takes us a step back, whereby we're now required to accept cash, and we'll get into the particulars of that. But it is, this provision will go into effect October the 3rd. So the time is now to be making plans and training and retraining folks who might be handling cash at these collection points. So this particular provision that was passed in the final version of the budget was introduced by the Senate. It was not in the governor's budget nor proposed by the House. And the new provision has 2 key components. One as applied to tickets for admission and the other as applied to concessions. So for ticket admission, the new provision states that any event or activity that a school conducts, sponsors, or participates in, and for which the school charges admission, the cash provisions will apply. So when we look at the words, the school conducts, sponsors, or participates in an event that charges admission, that isn't strictly limited to what might be the obvious today, athletic events, football season is coming up. This would also apply to plays, concerts, musical productions, anything that the school is conducting, sponsoring, or participating. This applies if the school charges admission. And so the new provision is that a school must permit an individual to pay cash for a ticket if the individual wishes to pay cash on the day of the event, if tickets are still available, and if the individual has enough cash to pay for the ticket. If those conditions are met and the school does not accept the cash payment from the individual, then the school must give the individual a free ticket. Folks that are selling tickets probably need to be retrained or refamiliarized with our board policies on handling cash and cash deposits and things of that nature, our ticket takers and other folks at these events. The second provision of the cash payment piece applies to concessions. So the rules are similar in that for all school events where concessions are sold, so concerts, plays, band performances, athletics, at least one concession stand per floor must accept cash. Now, I don't know what the consequences are for this one. If a school operating concessions does not accept cash, I don't know what the consequences are. We do know what they are for the ticket admission because individuals just get a free ticket. This I'm not sure. But one thing's for sure, those districts that have booster groups, for example, operating their concessions, booster groups will have to comply with these provisions because the events are being conducted by the school and the school has to comply. So we're going to need to start implementing again those policies on cash handling, cash management, cash deposits, etc. The next slide hits on two other components of transportation. Susan had touched on a couple others earlier on transportation, but this particular slide touches on a few other pieces that are also important that were in the final version of the budget. The first applies to students with disabilities. So this provision makes it clear that districts are required to provide, not optional, required to provide transportation to students with disabilities who live in the district but attend a non-public school if transportation is provided for in the IEP or individual service plan, and if supporting documentation for the transportation is submitted in conjunction with the IEP or individual service plan. So this is going to be a new requirement and it will go into effect this school year. So the time is now to start planning for that. On the subject of alternative vehicles, under the budget bill, school districts may now, they're not required to, but they're now permitted to, they may use a vehicle designated to carry 9 passengers or less, so AKA school van, for transportation of students to community and chartered non-public schools. Now, there are several requirements before a district would be permitted to use a vehicle of this nature to transport students to community and chartered non-publics. And the requirements are very specific. So the first is the number of students in the vehicle cannot exceed 9. And the second is the district must regularly transport students to that chartered non-public school. The third is the driver of this vehicle must have a valid license, not a CDL, but must have a valid license. And more importantly, the driver has to be accustomed to driving a vehicle of that nature. I don't know what the term accustomed means as it appears in the final version of the budget, but I'm sure we will find out as ODE undertakes the analysis and the rollout of this. A few other requirements for this alternate vehicle use for transporting students to community and charter non-public schools. The Senate added these requirements and they did make it into the final version of the bill. A qualified mechanic must inspect the vehicle at least twice a year. The driver of the vehicle cannot stop on the road to load or unload passengers. And the driver and all passengers must comply with seatbelt and child restraint system laws. So it's quite a bit here. But again, this piece on alternative vehicles is permissible use. It's not required, but it is now an option for districts so long as they comply with the requirements.
Okay, also on the subject of transportation, the bill does include a provision that requires DO to develop an optional model for bus drivers to essentially be able to, expand their employment into the full-time realm by working simultaneously as an educational aide or a student monitor. So this contemplates a situation where a bus driver may drive a morning route and then be hired, as a noontime aide or a student, aide in the afternoon. And the model that DO is required to develop has to ensure that drivers were working 8 to 10 hour shift per day. So this is an interesting one to me. I don't quite know, what the underpinnings of this was. Sherri might be able to answer that question, but obviously, if you have a bus driver who right now is maybe only driving a morning or afternoon route, or maybe is driving, both morning and afternoon routes, they may not be eligible for health insurance, right? Because they may not meet the hours requirement. And so something like this would then bring them into eligibility for health insurance. So that's an increased cost for the districts. There's also some collective bargaining agreements out there that already address dual employment situations. And there's one district that I represent that we just negotiated some changes to a dual employment section, which limited the amount of availability of dual employment that the district would allow for. So all of those kind of existing collective bargaining provisions may be impacted by this, or at least, even though this is written as an optional program, you may be hearing from your unions who are going to want to be pushing this because they will see this as an opportunity to get their members more pay and more benefits, of course. And then just a quick note on, there is a pilot program for transportation that has been implemented in the bill. And what this is really just kind of something to watch, unless you're in Franklin and Montgomery County, because those are the two counties that are participating in the pilot program in the 24-25 school year. But essentially what this program will do, it will kind of test out the ESC, actually providing transportation for one school district in their respective county, and how that might flesh out. So again, I think this is an attempt by the legislature to try to solve the student transportation problem that so many districts have right now. Okay, switching gears a bit to educator licensure. This is a change that I think we're going to see a lot of ripple effects from. So, and this is the grade band changes. So for any licenses that were issued after November 2nd of 2018, those grade bands are going to be changing to either pre-K through 8 and 6 through 12 instead of pre-K through 5, 4 to 9, and 7 to 12. And this applies, to all of really your primary licenses, right? Your resident educator license, professional, senior professional, and lead professional educator licenses. So And since it applies only to licenses that were issued after November 2nd, 2018, you're very well going to have kind of teachers teaching under two different categories of licensing, and which has a ton of bargaining implications, right? Because I mean, if you think about teacher licensure, teacher licensing, that can impact reductions in force. Who is first on the list for RIFs. It can impact bumping rights of teachers. It can impact vacancies, job bidding, transfers to different positions. So this is definitely something to take a look at your collective bargaining agreement to see, what the impact of these changes, will be, and, try to anticipate what kind of issues you may have in the future. And again, you may be seeing some demands to bargain because of this. Within the grade band changes, it is important to note that there is a provision that you can employ a teacher to teach within plus or minus 2 grade levels outside of their licensure, but not for more than 2 years at a time. So that does give some flexibility within those grade bands. Okay, and Lisa's going to talk about pre-service educator permits.
Yes, so still under the subject of educator licensure, because there were several provisions that made their way into the final version of the budget bill. One is on pre-service educator permit, another is on computer science license. So in the pre-service educator permit, the state board is required to create a permit for students enrolled in an educator prep program. And the permit will require wrap back enrollment and allows the licensee under this permit to substitute teach. Arguably, the provision was perhaps introduced to help support the need for substitute teachers, which is well and good. Perhaps some of the unintended consequences might be the potential application of a licensure code of professional conduct to these students who are enrolled in educator prep programs, because now they're going to hold a license or a permit issued by ODE. And getting those folks trained and are aware about what those provisions even say and that they apply to them, a little bit tricky business. And then the computer science license, this was actually part of the governor's initiative, largely unmodified by the House and Senate as the bill made its way through the process. The license is targeted at industry professionals in computer science. The license will have 4 different grade band specifications. There's a PK5, a 4.9, a 7.12, and a K12. And the state superintendent under the final version of the bill is required to consult with the Chancellor of Higher Ed in developing the requirements for this computer science license. The Senate version of the bill, which made its way into the final version, added an extension through the 24-25 school year to the current exemption that allows individuals who hold a valid teaching license to teach computer science, with the added requirement that that individual complete PD courses with computer science content knowledge. So that's just a small little caveat, but the whole purpose of the new computer science license, of course, is per the governor's initiative as proposed in his version of the budget.
Okay, so we have about 20 slides left and we're running a little bit late on time. So I'm just gonna kind of quickly go through this. This relates to the temporary provisions that are in place for substitute teachers. This is the provision, the existing provision that allows districts to hire subs that don't hold a post-secondary degree as long as they pass a background check, are deemed to be of good moral character, and meet any local requirements that the school district may set. So that license was set to expire this school year, the 23-24 school year. So the bill extends that license to this year, and then puts the onus on the State Board of Education to establish renewal procedures. So essentially the bill has made this kind of temporary licensing of substitute teachers more permanent. And then we just have to kind of wait and see what the State Board of Ed disseminates in terms of renewal procedure and renewal criteria. Okay, Lisa?
Right, flying through this slide here, still on the subject of educator licensure. The teacher residency program will now be updated to allow for online or in-person mentoring. And the alternative resident educator program has been reduced from a 4-year program to a 2-year program.
Okay, we talked earlier about the military educator program that was established last year. This kind of goes along with this. This is the alternative military educator license. I think what's to know about this is that there's a provision that allows for military individuals to receive a license on a more expedited basis, and they are permitted to substitute out military training for some of the licensure requirements. That would include college coursework, PD, content knowledge, examinations, or other licensure requirements. So what the bill did was, again, they put the onus on the state board to determine what type of military training would correspond with the required educational training. So this is another one to keep an eye out for those details. Okay, and this is Lisa.
Just a 1-year non-renewable out-of-state educator license provision was added. That this particular license can be obtained without completing 6 of the required 12 hours of coursework in teaching of reading if the applicant passes the Foundations of Reading exam on the first attempt.
Okay, school counselor training requirements. I mentioned this earlier. This again relates to kind of the focus on expanding access to trade education in school districts. So now any school counselors that serve grades 7 through 12 must now complete 4 hours of PD essentially regarding job opportunities and available apprenticeships for certain trades. And that training, that 4-hour training, has to be accomplished every 5 years rather. So if you're currently in your last 2 years of your license, then you do have some additional time to do the training. You just have to complete the training within the next 5-year renewal period. And this training does count towards any PD hours. So, it may not be too late to get this kind of training in on your convocation days or your opening school days this school year, or at least throughout the school year as you do that PD. What I did think was interesting is it does specify that the State Board of Ed has to contract with construction trade organizations to develop the training, and that the trade organizations must ensure that ample opportunity for training will be there, and they must also bear the cost of that training. This also could have some bargaining implications just to keep in mind in terms of your PD. Some collective bargaining agreements go into more detail in terms of whether PD can be more teacher or employee directed versus administrative directed, that sort of thing. So that's something to take a look at. And Lisa's going to talk about training and coaches.
Yeah, so just 2 pieces here. Mental health first. This was a separate piece of pending legislation that the House just decided to wrap into its version of the budget. It was unchanged by the Senate, and it now requires our coaches to complete a student mental health training course and submit proof of completion each time the coach applies to renew a pupil activity permit. The courses are to be approved by the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. And then minor change on the cardiac arrest and brain trauma training for coaches. Instead of annually, the training is now completed within the duration of the individual's previous pupil activity permit.
We've already talked about this in part 1 a bit, but the RAP Back program has been expanded to non-licensed individuals. So schools will now be getting notifications of any criminal issues if they arise during employment, and schools may also require non-licensed employees to obtain a new BCI background check if it's more than a year old. Excuse me. So we're at the period of time that would normally be questions. I see one question in the Q&A box, but we do have some important components yet to talk about. So we're going to keep going through the slides if you all can bear with us, but I do believe we'll be able to get you out of here by 3:45, which was the original kind of end date with end time with the Q&A. So third grade reading guarantee. This is something I was following quite a bit as a parent of a school age student, elementary age student. I was kind of interested to see how the third grade reading guarantee fleshed out, in kind of real life, beyond what I already knew about it as a school district attorney. But the number one thing is the third grade reading guarantee has been removed. So now under the provisions of the House bill, a student may be promoted even if they are struggling with reading and not reading at their current grade level, if the parent requests that they be promoted, and if the parent and guardian consults with the reading teacher and the principal. But districts are absolutely still required to continue to receive or to provide reading intervention services to that student until they reach reading at their grade level. For students that were retained for this school year under the third grade reading guarantee, then those students must be promoted if the only reason they were retained was because of their performance on the third grade reading assessment, unless the parent or guardian requests that the student remain retained. And again, it requires intensive reading instruction for the student until they're reading at grade level. So the focus on getting a student up to par in terms of reading at grade level is still there. It's just not, the consequences of a student not being able to do that in third grade, it's not so draconian as it was on a third grade reading guarantee. Now, if you have students that are non-proficient that are promoted to fourth grade, then they have to continue receiving reading intervention services, and the districts must send out written notification to the parents that details the connection between reading at the grade level and long-term success. So you're going to be wanting to be developing kind of template letters that can be used for that purpose. And then the district must also implement a reading improvement monitoring plan for those students, which includes high dosage tutoring. And it has to continue, that plan has to continue in place until they're reading at their current grade level. High dosage tutoring is considered to be aligned with the student's classroom instruction, done through a state approved vendor or locally approved opportunity aligned to high dosage best practices. And it must include additional instruction time of at least 3 days per week, or at least 50 hours over 36 weeks. And this improvement plan also must align with the science of reading, which is a term we've heard already here today that is used a lot in the House bill. And the science of reading is a defined term, and it's defined in these provisions under like the instructional and curriculum provisions in House Bill 33. Okay. And Lisa's going to talk about reading instruction.
Yep, more on the buzzword science of reading. As we discussed a little bit earlier, there is the requirement that do develop the high quality core curriculum and instructional materials in ELA that school districts will be required to use and to purchase. The districts will be required to begin using these not later than 24-25 school year. One of the key provisions in the science of reading materials is that there's now a prohibition on the use of any core curriculum, instructional materials, or intervention programs in grades pre-K 6 or pre-K 5 that use the 3 cueing approach. Now, not being an educator myself, I'm not going to try to explain that with any level of detail, but I will outline the exceptions to this. And there are 2 exceptions to the prohibition on the use of any core curriculum, instructional materials, or intervention programs that use 3 cueing. And those 2 exceptions are: 1, if a waiver is obtained from due, Or 2, if the 3 queuing approach is explicitly provided for in a student's IEP, then it will still be permitted. Again, this is more for a rollout in 24-25 school year, but it's certainly something that districts need to start to begin to prepare for, particularly as that purchase process is rolled out for FY24. The next, I think, 2 slides talk about dyslexia. The first one is professional development. The completion dates have been somewhat staggered now by virtue of the final version of the bill. For those employees that were hired before April 12th of 2021, and for those employees that were hired after April 12th of 2021. And we can see the timelines aligned with the teaching grades there. For those teachers that are currently employed in a district who are teaching K1 and who were hired before April 12, 2021, they still have a couple of weeks to finish the dyslexia PD, because that has to be completed by the beginning of 23-24 school year. And for those teachers that are hired after April 12, 2021, teaching K1, they now have either 2 years from the date of hire in the district or the date that's set forth in the left-hand column of the slide there, whichever is later. And there is another key component for the dyslexia PD that was added, that there is no additional training required if an employee completed the training while employed by a different district before they were hired by that particular district. Also on the subject of dyslexia, the next slide speaks to screening. And the final version of the budget bill clarifies dates and timelines for completing screening for transfer students, and those are set forth in the slide there. The governor's version of the budget, and as passed, requires screenings to be aligned with the grade level in which the student is enrolled at the time the screening is administered. That clarification was passed. And in addition to that, some of the notes in the final version of the budget bill indicate a school district is not required to administer a tier 1 screening to a transfer student who received screening in the same school year at the student's school of origin. And the notes in the final version also indicate that ODE is to identify a tier 1 screening measure by January 1 of 24. So a little less than 6 months from now, and make it available to all public schools free of charge. Districts will be required to use this screening, the tier 1 screening measure, starting with the 24-25 school year.
Okay, the next provision relates to seizure action plans. So the bill requires that districts complete an individualized seizure action plan for each student that has a seizure disorder diagnosis. And the district must provide training every 2 years to ensure that at least one employee other than the school nurse is trained on implementation of the seizure action plans. And so for those of you not familiar with the seizure action plan, these are typically plans that authorize certain school employees to be able to administer medication if a student is having an active seizure during school. What is important to note is this bill does provide qualified immunity to school district employees if they take actions under the seizure action plan and something goes awry, unless that person acts with willful or wanton conduct, then the qualified immunity would not be invoked. There are notification requirements, so the district has to notify employees who regularly interact with the student of the existence and the content of the seizure action plan. So, and that notification is to employees, contractors, or volunteers who regularly interact with students that have a legitimate educational interest in the student, or is responsible for the supervision of the student, or responsible for the transportation of the student to and from school. So obviously that's your bus drivers, and I think it would also be your bus aides if they're on the bus, with a student that has one of these action plans. There's a training component that says that requires that each administrator, guidance counselor, teacher, or driver must complete minimum 1 hour training no later than October 3rd, 2025. But you do want to be sure to be looking at this, right away this school year to determine the amount of students that may need these sort of action plans and start implementing that right away. Lisa's going to talk about the next slide.
This is a quick one. I know we're about 4 minutes away from even the end of our Q&A segment, but there is a provision in the final version of that bill that requires public school districts to provide a student's parents with the student's score on any state assessment during that school year. And the scores must be provided to the parent by no later than June 30th of each school year. The scores can be delivered via email, regular mail, or can be posted in a secure portal on the district's website.
Student records, it's important to note that the bill does contain a provision that districts are required to transmit a transferring student's school records within 5 school days of a request, and records may only be withheld if there is $2,500 or more of outstanding debt. And once that debt is paid, then the district must transmit those records.
So this particular slide addresses a provision in the bill on intra-district open enrollment. So that's for those districts that use intra-district enrollment for students that are residents of the district. This does not apply to inter-district open enrollment, which means the district accepts open enrolled students from outside the district. This is just for those districts that allow for intra-district open enrollment, where students can move around from their assigned school within the district, who are also district residents. So there are 2 key provisions on intra-district open enrollment. For those districts that do it and they conduct it by lottery, the lottery must now be conducted on the 2nd Monday in June prior to the school year in which the student is seeking the intra-district enrollment. I don't know why it's the 2nd Monday in June, but that is what it is. And now, more universally, districts are required to report to the number of students attending a school within the district, other than the school they would normally be assigned to under the intra-district provisions. The next slide on auxiliary services. This one, to me, I've read it multiple times. It leaves a lot of information to be desired. So hopefully there will be some further information forthcoming from ODE. They typically produce the guidebook annually for auxiliary services, but the final version of the budget contains a prohibition on school districts from denying a non-public school's request for personnel to provide auxiliary services, so long as those folks are properly licensed by a state board or agency. The code provision that this particular piece in the budget modifies is ORC 3317.06. We don't have time to get into all the particulars, but I do expect ODE to release some guidance materials on this, since there is now a strict prohibition on school districts' ability to deny requests for personnel for auxiliary services.
Just a quick note regarding a change that was made relative to board members. So existing law, this is contained in Ohio Revised Code 3313-33. Existing law prohibits a school board member from having any direct or indirect pecuniary interest in any contract of the board, with the exception of if that school board member is employed by a political subdivision or agency of the state, then the board can contract with that state agency, for example, as long as the board member does not engage in any discussions relative to the contract, and as long as the board member submits an affidavit stating their role with the state agency. In the House Bill 33, there's now a provision that would allow that exemption to occur if you have a school board member who is employed by college or university of higher education, the Board of Ed may contract with that college for college credit plus courses, for instance, as long as the board member who's employed by the college doesn't participate in any way and files an affidavit. So something to keep in mind, and for those board members who may be attending, or for you superintendents, if you have a board member in that situation. And we're coming on the home stretch of our slides.
Yep. So back on the subject of computer science, this particular piece was part of the governor's budget proposal, made its way into the final version, requires all public schools that serve grades 7 to 12 to participate in the Ohio Computer Science Promise Program, beginning with 24-25 school year. The program would allow Ohio resident students in grades 7 through 12 to enroll tuition-free in one computer science program that's not provided by the school, and the student would receive high school credit.
Okay, in terms of homeschooling, there are some provisions in the bill that I think are designed to make it easier for parents to implement, a home education for their students. So it changes the term home instruction that's used in existing law to home education. Does contain a definition of home education, but essentially what the provision does is it requires parents to notify the superintendent of a district within 5 days of their beginning home education, or upon moving into the district or withdrawing from a school and starting home education. And then the parent also has to notify by August 30th of each school year. But why this makes it easier on parents is if the parent gives notification to the superintendent, under existing law, the superintendent still has to take the step to excuse the student from in-school instruction, where here, once the parent gives notice of the homeschooling and the superintendent receives it, then it's effective right then. There's no extra step required by the superintendent besides sending written acknowledgement, but there's no kind of approval or excuse needed to be granted by the superintendent for that to become effective. And then also it does, the bill also does specify that a student who discontinues home education and goes back to in-person schooling must be placed into the grade, that is appropriate for them, without any sort of discrimination or prejudice. And then finally, it does allow a parent of a student who is being homeschooled to issue a school and agent schooling certificate rather than putting the requirement of the superintendent to do so. Okay, so we just have kind of a quick punch list or checklist for the school year that Lisa's going to take you through.
All the items here on the slide are important, and it's not to minimize the importance of any of them that I don't mention, but I think as Susan and I prepared the materials for today, we agree that the following items on this list are things that really should be on administrator to-do list now, in anticipation of that October 3rd implementation date. So the first would be provide reduced price lunches and breakfasts free of charge if you're a district that participates in the national program. 2, provide feminine hygiene products. 3, provide for cash payments at school affiliated events, and that includes for ticket purchases as well as concession. Promotion of students retained under the 3rd grade reading guarantee for 23-24 school year, provided certain conditions are met. Development of seizure action plans and professional development for same. And then the transfer record provisions related to student transfer requests. All the items on the checklist are important, but those would be, I think Susan and I would agree, would be on the top of the administrator to-do list at the moment.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then we do have a couple questions in our box. So one question is, do districts have to make up days if they are over state minimum hours? So this relates to the calamity days. And most districts I work with have built into their school calendar many more hours than are required by the state, minimum requirements. So in those cases, makeup days would not be required. It's just if you're getting close to that threshold, then that's when you got to start looking at the making up of hours. And then to the reduced meals that will now be free, does the fee waiver apply or only to those who qualify for free lunch initially? And Lisa, I'll leave that one to you.
So the bill was silent on that particular piece. It did not address the fee waiver at all. There was no provision that addressed that. So for the moment, we'll sit tight and kind of wait to see if there's further guidance coming from ODE on that, and or wait to see the actual new statutory language once it's developed by Legislative Service Commission and rolled out. But the budget documents did not touch on the issue of the fee waiver, but it's a great question.
Well, thank you everyone for hanging in there with us. My apologies for going over a little bit, but as you can tell, there's a lot in the budget bill that impacts school districts. So we want to make sure to reach as much as we could in this webinar. Again, just a reminder, the recording will be available online and will be emailed to you as well, the handouts, and then certainly Lisa, Sherri, and I are available to answer any follow-up questions that you may have. Thank you all for attending.